Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker on children, caregiving, and competitiveness. Many of you have seen the Florida Chamber Foundation's report on untapped potential that was released before this year's legislative session. It showed that our state has a loss of $5.4 billion each year due to inadequate childcare for our workforce, and that is huge. Our keynote today will take us a step further, looking at the data on how employees' caregiving responsibilities affect employers directly in surprising ways. Of course, this is important to us at the movement and our Bosses for Babies initiative, where we've gathered business champions for early childhood who know that when businesses support families, everyone wins. Joseph Fuller no longer has young children at home, but he knows the joy of being a grandparent. He is a professor at the Harvard Business School, where he co-directs the school's long-term project, Managing the Future of Work. He also co-heads the university-wide project on the workforce. And that means he spends his days anticipating what you need to know about the future. I'll turn the floor over to you now, Joe, and then we'll come back shortly for a conversation with a couple of our Bosses for Babies. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Madeline. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know the important impact that the children's movement has had in Florida, and that I'm hopeful this conversation can advance the dialogue there and come up with more innovative answers. As you might imagine, being a professor at Harvard Business School, a lot of my focus is on the important role employers play in either causing caregivers to be marginalized in the workforce or engaging them and empowering them to participate in the workforce. So as we get going this morning, I'd like to share a little bit of my research, all of which can be found on our website here at Harvard Business School. So if you just Google my name and the future of work, Harvard Business School, after a couple of commercial ads, you'll find a lot more data of the type we're going to touch on very briefly this morning. Let me ask that the slides get turned on now so we can share them. And we'll go to the first slide, please. We'll go to the next slide. So I think all of this discussion and that $5.4 billion number that Madeline cited is a function of the tightness of the US labor market. And here we can see that what's the so-called market tightness index, which just shows how little spare capacity there is in terms of people who want to be in the workforce but are not currently engaged, has got workforce participation in the United States leveled off around the year 2000. And while there's been a very modest uptick in women's workforce participation recently, generally it's been stagnant in the post-COVID era. And that means that employers in the US are beginning to face something that's driven by that lower workforce participation rate, but also the slowing growth of the population in the US. We have a new situation in the US where labor, particularly labor with certain types of skills, is likely to be in a long-term short supply. We're going to have a shortage for a while. And therefore, it's particularly important on multiple axes that employers do what they can to bring more people into the workforce. Next slide, please. Well, let's talk about women's workforce participation. And when we look at workforce participation through the lens of what causes people not to be seeking work outside the home, as you can see on the left-hand choice, 50% of women who report that they would be interested in work, but they're unable to work outside the home currently, are doing that because of caregiving obligations. So really a big driver of workforce participation for women is their need to give care to children, seniors, spouses who are sick or disabled. I also want you to take a quick note that another 25%, that salmon color, is for self-care. So caregiving for one's own conditions, one's own health, physical, mental, disease state. And so really 75% of those outside the workforce formally are being driven by some type of caregiving concern. Now, you can see from the right-hand side, the single largest set of drivers of that 50% rather, are having a newborn or newly adopted child, a child that injured, has a disability, a long-term care need, or just the daily needs of being a homemaker, getting kids to school, to other projects, and then the so-called sandwich generation kicks in about the middle of the list when people are taking care of both kids and seniors. Now, another big driver, if we can go to the next slide, please, of the isolation of caregivers from the workforce is cost. And here, if you just look at the blue lines at the bottom, a lot of things in society have become way, way, way less expensive over time. Just look at that bottom line. All of us can remember when big screen TVs were huge luxury. Now you have disposable brands of big screen TVs with people like Vizio. But if you advance the slide one more, you'll see that childcare and nursery school costs are among the most consistently growing costs in all costs in the United States. So that has the effect of estranging women from the workforce. And that's particularly dangerous for employers on two dimensions. And as this slide shows, what we've seen over time, really over the last 40 years, is an inversion of a historical relationship in terms of who gets advanced degrees in the United States. This shows master's degrees in blue, PhD degrees in that light lemony green. And you can see that women are an absolute majority of both. Women today are also an absolute majority of people in four-year colleges. As a matter of fact, 58% of current four-year college enrollees are women. Now, employers are regularly looking for people with more advanced skills, better grounding in various topics, and often have a bias not animated by a prejudice against non-degree holders, although that has been a problem in our workforce historically, toward people that have advanced degrees. And in the United States, and by the way, this is the case in India, France, UK, Brazil, almost all our peer competitors, women are an absolute majority of people getting those advanced degrees. So the workforce, in terms of people you recruit with a higher ed background, is increasingly female. But there's another important consideration that has to do with the importance of what we call social skills. Go to the next slide, please. Social skills are skills of a type that have to do with the ability to interact with others, go into a familiar group, communicate very effectively, be able to motivate somebody, be able to build a cordial relationship with someone who might be a rival for advancement. And here you can see, in very interesting research done by the Pew Center, the degree to which women exceed men in social skills quotient. So if you look to the left-hand side, that second axis where you see the 40 and the 52, on social skills, women have a 20% plus advantage over men. Now, that is not news to most of the women in the audience today. It's a little bit of a hard message for people like me, but that's a very material gap. And social skills are getting more important for work of all types. Research for everything from CEOs, which I did, to frontline workers, which one of my co-heads of one of our big projects here at Harvard, Professor David Deming, did, show that both compensation and the in jobs and the types of jobs that are growing faster than average in the United States have higher social skills quotients. Why is that? Well, if you think about particularly digital technologies, data-driven technologies, and now AI, a lot of the things that are technical hard skills are being automated. And what's left are the human skills that make somebody efficient and effective in dealing with other types of other assets which are flawed, imperfect, emotional, i.e. other human beings. So on the two most important axes that employers are looking for today, advanced degrees and social skills, women are clearly in the lead. And therefore, it is an imperative for employers to make their work more women-friendly. And as we saw in that pie chart, that means focusing on care. Now, let me go to the next slide, please. One might think this is a theoretical problem alone, but in work I did before COVID and then updated marginally after COVID, what we saw that caregiving obligations drives significant voluntary turnover. What does voluntary turnover mean? What does the phrase mean? Quitting or resigning. We asked workers, had they left one or more jobs in their careers because they couldn't reconcile the responsibilities they have in caregiving with the obligations of work. And what we found was that on the whole, more than a third had said they had done that at least once. But interestingly, if you took those people who said they had resigned at least once and segmented them by which quartile in their employer they ranked in, a frontline employee all the way to a senior leader, the likelihood of leaving went up with your salary, with your title, with your pay grade, with your responsibilities. So that adds a third consideration to our list for employers. Employers want people with advanced degrees, they want people with good social skills, and presumably they want to keep their top paid talent. And care is driving women who have those degrees, have those social skills disproportionately relative to men, and from senior ranks systematically out of the company, because employers have expectations of workers who are also caregivers that are just too hard to reconcile with their needs and their personal obligations. Does that mean employers being brutal, hard-nosed, nasty, mean-spirited? Of course not. It just means that job design and promotion paths are still firmly rooted in the logic of the 60s and 70s, as opposed to today's workforce, which is more female and has the requirement to tap into the types of skills we were describing earlier. Now, if we go to the next slide, please, here's a list of people who are caregivers who said, what were the biggest challenges they had in reconciling work with their caregiving obligations? And you can see the first two is, and the first column is their first choice. The second column is the combination of their first two choices. That disproportionately, the stress and the time associated with exercising caregiving responsibilities was more than they could handle. So that tells us something about whether or not employers are doing something to relieve that stress and make time more flexible so people can balance those considerations. Now, you remember earlier I asked you to look at that salmon part of the circle about self-care. Look at what the third driver is. 13% lack of time for self-care. So we think of, in our debate about caregiving, we tend to gravitate to a discussion about taking care of kids. The first three reasons on the list that caregivers leave the workforce, obviously built into the name of your organization, but senior care and self-care are also major contributors to the inability of women to participate fully in the workforce. One last thing I forgot to mention on the previous slide is those rates of departure are almost equal across gender. So highly paid men, you remember 49% overall said in the top quartile they had left. That's true of both men and women. It's not merely a female phenomenon. Next slide, please. So I got very interested in how do we understand the economics of this for employers? And employers may, feel a great deal of affection and affiliation for their workers, but they are companies and governments are economic entities. They're trying to make budgets. They're trying to preserve, grow their company or contain their cost if they're a governmental agency. And what I wanted to understand in more detail is how is it that caregiving and either the lack of the turnover associated with the need to balance care and work, or an absence of productivity, were effective employer economics? Because employers aren't going to give people more flexibility or pay for better care benefits to feel better about themselves. They're going to do it if the economics make sense to them. So I asked caregivers, if when you got some caregiving support, did it help you miss fewer days of work or be more productive? And 2/3 said yes. Also importantly, did it help you avoid taking a leave of absence or resigning? You see that 30%. That's pretty close to the 34% overall number I found across all 4 of those quartiles of the workforce. So if you've got your female workforce or your caregiver workforce, you can reduce their turnover by 1/3 by giving better benefits and more accommodations. That's big money for an employer. That's definitely worth the attention. If you can make your workforce significantly more productive, because 64% of the time they're going to be able to work more days or avoid having important meetings postponed or canceled, that's big money. That's worth your time. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what I did was analysis and a piece of work I published this past winter. And here I was trying to answer a challenge that employers have made to me, which is, well, how do we know that a benefit is going to work? And this particular analysis focused on a company called Wealthy. Wealthy, I find a very confusing name because everyone thinks it's like a firm that advises you on your retirement portfolio or something, as opposed to about wellness. But what Wealthy does is provide case services for people who have a significant caregiving event in their family. So the employee is covered to receive this service if, for example, a spouse or a parent or a child gets a serious medical diagnosis. And rather than, since employers kept saying, prove it to me that investing in a service like that is worthwhile, I decided to change the discussion and to say, since I can't prove the goodness, the legitimacy of something you're not prepared to do by the caregiving benefit, until I prove it to you, I'm stuck in a self-fulfilling prophecy. I can't prove something is good unless you're willing to do it. And you're not willing to do it unless I can prove it's good. So let's change the discussion to ask, how good does good have to be? Let's put a reality test against this. This is a little complicated. As I said, you can pull a paper down from my website. But this relates to reducing turnover. And the costs of turnover, as experienced by employer, are a function of, multiplying 2 variables. What's my turnover rate? How many people are leaving? And what does it cost me to replace them? And depending on how much you make, employers find that the ratio of what someone makes who's left and the cost to replace them kind of follows some normative rules. So the most conservative elements are that line along the bottom. You see 33% of salary to replace. For a very low skilled worker in an entry level job, that's the minimum. Most people say it's the next line up, 50%. But if you start getting into managerial levels, it often approaches 100%. And for executive levels, 150% or more. So what we calculated here was pick a combination as an employer that you think is right. Let's say you have mostly frontline, low-paid staff. In many, many companies, that turns over to 50% a year. And if you just go right to the middle of the chart and say, if I could reduce my turnover, which is 50%, by 4 points, and it costs me 33% of salary to replace all those people, the cost of the return I get for providing everybody in the workforce with the wealthy benefit, you can read on the vertical axis. If you look at that intercept, it's close to 100% payback. And if you talk about reducing those people most likely to turn over, that 49% in the top quartile, now you're talking about the best investment any company would be making in any given year. Hundreds of percent return on investment for giving your employees more reason to stay, reducing turnover, and building alignment and commitment with those workers. The same thing applies on the next slide when we look at improvement in productivity. There you can see, by the way, the percentage of workers who said that using this specific benefit had helped them avoid quitting. So there's that 30% numbers, kind of showing up a lot. We'll go to the next slide now, please. Here we look at a much smaller number, which is absenteeism. Because absenteeism doesn't have that hard and fast cost of, oh gosh, I got to go hire somebody, I got to post jobs, I'm going to have to pay Indeed or ZipRecruiter or even a headhunter, lots of money to find me good candidates. So here we use the exact same type of analysis. It's return on the vertical axis, but how many hours per quarter, just hours per quarter, would having the benefit save? So you can see for a caregiver who is missing a day and a half a quarter in that middle line, 12 and a half hours per quarter. If you reduce their turnover materially, once again, you've got a terrific return on investment in the 20s. And if it's only a marginal benefit, if basically you've got somebody who's missing a day or a day and a half a year because of caregiving. Well, if you go back to what's really driving people's decision to miss work or to have to skip work, it's much more frequent than that. And I know you know that through your hard work with families and kids. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here you can see, by the way, that almost 70% of workers in the poll I did said they had missed less work because of the benefit. Now here we just ask, what are the types of benefits that workers say they'd really benefit from? In terms of what they said they would find the most helpful, it's listed on the left-hand side. And you can see in the blue column how many people, how many companies offer that benefit today. So about 51% of companies say we offer flexible scheduling, 50% unpaid leave. You can read the rest for yourself. What's the usage rate in those companies that offer those benefits? That's in the green. So when you offer flexible scheduling, 90% of your workforce engages with that. If you offer paid family medical leave, 43% of employers offer that, almost 60%, 57% of people will make use of it. The amber color on the far right is what percentage of workers would have used the benefit were it available to them. So that's an increment of, if my employer offered it, would I use it? You may look at some of these things and say, huh, it's funny, there's some anomalies between the numbers. Remember that people know what's being offered by their employers. So they have an expectation or a need for something like a caregiving benefit. They may not take a job if it's not offered. So let's go just walk through the logic of here one more time. And we'll go to the last slide, please. So for employers, what we believe is important here at Harvard Business School is they first of all have to understand the overall costs of caregiving and how the economics of benefits work. They have to understand their care demographics. How many people do they have who are caring for kids with chronic illnesses, who have a sandwich generation, who have a two-income household where the calendaring and work schedule constraints of the non-employee adult is inflexible, and therefore inflicts a lot of caregiving obligations on you, the person you employ. Job descriptions, career paths, managerial incentives, they're all rooted in old logic, certainly a pre-COVID logic, but also a logic of 30, 40 years ago that this is what the job is, this is what it calls for, your life beyond here isn't my concern, shouldn't be something that I have to take into account. People 30 years ago used to do this job just fine. That just doesn't work anymore. Having a culture where caregiving is legitimized, where leaders talk about it, talk about their own care experiences, how it affected their work and productivity, and if the company wants to help them through, employees through that. And then look at your current caregiving services and get feedback about whether they're any good. A lot of companies confuse what I'm talking about with like employee information, employee benefit information programs that really have very little impact and very little substantive help. All they do is employee assistance programs where people answer your questions about the benefits you do or do not have. That's not a benefit. That's a reference librarian. We need to really get clear-eyed about what works and what doesn't and why. So Madeline, let me kick it back to you to maybe get some questions and engage some other people.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to have to hold myself back here as I sit in the sandwich generation, receiving tons of text messages from folks saying how much this resonates, because we only have time for a couple of questions, and I need to invite a couple of our Bosses for Babies members to join us in a conversation and Q&A. So Madeline Pumariega is president of Miami-Dade College, the nation's largest institution of higher education, and the first woman to hold that post. She's a former nonprofit CEO, former chancellor of the Florida college system, and has consistently been dedicated to helping young adults attain and succeed in college. And Brian Butler is president and CEO of Vistra Communications, also a member of the board of the U.S. Chamber, a veteran, and a very active citizen in Tampa, where he co-founded the initiative CEOs in Schools. So as their faces come up here, Brian, welcome. I just want to ask each of you, and I know we'll have Madeline here in just a second. There you are. Hello. Want to ask each of you just for maybe initial reactions to what you've just heard and a question for Dr. Fuller. Madeline, go ahead.
Okay, didn't know if Brian was going to start. No, I think Dr. Fuller's presentation really is validating, not only as a female leader in education, but what we see among our students. 60% of our students are females. So it's all of his data is so consistent with the chamber report and labor participation. And so I think, to Dr. Fuller, I'd like to ask him, he touched upon it a little bit, but how do employers and how do our partners on this call strike the right balance? Because we know that it's not just the childcare aspect, the sandwich generation, Madeline, as you just spoke about, life-work balance. And oftentimes the oversteering is remote work. And the remote work, really what we're seeing is, and especially for women who you see the social skills are so important for us to thrive. What's that right balance for our partners to think about creating that to keep not only attract women into the workplace, but more importantly, support them and make sure that they thrive and stay in the workplace. I have young leaders who'll tell me sometimes it's more expensive to come to work than to stay because of the childcare. So what are those variables that we could be thinking about in terms of policy and practice?
Well, I think the first is to really understand that you have much more economically at stake than you may think. These conversations you're having with your workers are not just about, are you trying to be accommodating? Are you trying to be kind? Are you trying to be a family-friendly organization? There's hard economics on the table. And I'm not saying that I want to turn the whole conversation into a kind of Ebenezer Scrooge-like conversation, but there's a real, there are cultural stakes and there are economic stakes. The second thing is that the vast majority of workers they don't have exotic, desperate needs, where they're expecting the employer to do 7 things for them at once. They have things, they're about 8 or 10 very specific things. I'll just give a quick illustration. School drop-off. Who's dropping off the kids at school? And is that going to put me in the teeth of the worst commute so that I'm going to rush to get the kids to school, then panic because it's going to take me 75 minutes to get to the office, and I'm going to be a minimum of 15 minutes late. Why do I have to be there at 9 o'clock given my job? Is it okay for me to arrive somewhere closer to 10 and either through remote work or working later because my significant other spouse is doing pickup or grandma or whomever else? So these are, understand what the individual actually needs. A lot of it is quite benign. The second thing, and I'll leave it at that, is that you have to think in terms not just of people, but of processes. It's processes that really drive people's schedules. So letting the people that run processes, managers, design their own solutions as opposed to come up with these ironclad, this is the way, these are the rules. Because a lot of managers will know, yeah, we have the weekly meeting and it's just fine if it's all remote. Or if we do it once a month, it's fine, as opposed to everyone's got to be in for every meeting. So it requires a little more investment in customization. But what you get back in terms of retention, productivity, and commitment to the organization makes it really a very straightforward position.
Thank you very much. Brian, what's on your mind?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Fuller, for sharing your research. And I so much appreciate the tie from not making this just a challenge about education, but also providing a business case for our businesses to better understand and embrace. I did not understand this until I really got involved with the program we started called CEOs in Schools, where I actually spent time on site more than just 1 hour at a time. And I challenged business leaders to spend, to come into our schools and to get involved in a more meaningful way by being there for a full day. And that has really is doing some things that I think that change this community. But I use that as a setup to my question for you. You mentioned that so much of our work skills and design of work was founded in the 60s and probably has not changed much. Is there a bigger issue here? Is there a clash of culture that is prohibiting businesses to think differently about how to modify these schedules to meet today and tomorrow's demands?
I think it's a great question, Brian. The short answer is yes. if you are a very senior leader in an organization, you often manage in many of the ways that you observe your bosses manage you. Not every one of you might have had a terrible boss you didn't like and respect, but you grew up not only emulating very effective bosses, but living by a different set of rules. I don't know what the analogy of the sports, but a lot of people grew up in what we would think of as the dead ball era in baseball, or when you had to play tennis with a wooden racket or something like that. And also you put that together with that many leaders, particularly men in organizations, grew up in a more I'll call it traditional culture. And it's been a while since they had to worry about school pickup. And, their kids didn't grow up in a social media world with internet where they can get in all sorts of trouble if they're left at home with devices. They didn't, they just a little bit removed from it. And so when you start challenging with them on things like your job descriptions contribute to half of your highest paid quartile workers leaving regularly. Is that the workers' problem or is that the job descriptions problem? You've got people for lower wage workers who your supervisor in your retail site knows is an outstanding worker who's got a bad car. And they've been late for work 3 days this month, and by rule, you have to terminate them because the rule says 3 latenesses in a month, you're fired, or 6 in a year, you're fired. Even though that supervisor is saying, this is crazy. So you have to revisit policies, you have to revisit job descriptions, and the best way you can do it is simply ask and listen to what people say about how their life actually works, not the stylized way, the job description, or the stylized way the experience of that senior executive remembers it, and make it clear that discussing the totality of their life is perfectly okay. That you don't want it. You had to take care of your mother-in-law too. You had a kid who was ADHD or special needs or had terrible asthma or whatever it is, and you remember those days, and you look back now at you're amazed you got through it. Now I want to help you get through it. And companies that signal that and demystify the whole discussion and make it legitimate and acceptable and safe, get a great return in terms of engagement, productivity, and commitment from workers.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, if I may. And this really has to do with the state of Florida and the size of our businesses. And we have many businesses that are in the 5 to 10 employee range,
Yep.
5 to 15 employee range. What is your advice for those businesses different than, let's say, the enterprise that my friend Madeline runs, that she's probably got, over 1,000 employees in the workplace?
Well, first of all, Madeline, I'm sure it's true of both Madelines, but Madeline, the educator, runs one of the outstanding community colleges in the United States. Yes. Full stop. It's a huge resource for Florida.
Yes.
Small employers, of course, have a couple of real structural demands. One is usually small means owner operated, or the owner is present a lot, even if they're not operating business day to day. And if you're spending money on a benefit or on overtime for a worker because another worker is unreliably able to show up for work, that's money not out of Walmart's pocket or Costco's pocket or Home Depot's pocket. That's out of my pocket. The good news is the workers. And so what we find very often is that those smaller businesses really do value stability in the workforce because they took a long time to get a workforce that's committed and capable and productive, and they're very loath to do things. So I think that here the role of social service agencies and states become really important. There's a whole movement, among employers in various cities in the United States to work together. The original version of this was called The Source. It started in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where local smaller and mid-sized providers bounded together to finance some advisors for their workers because they kept bumping into problems HR couldn't handle or they couldn't handle as an owner operator. For example, I'm about to get evicted. I've got a good worker about to get evicted, or I've got someone who's got a returning citizen from incarceration. How do I manage that? They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. And they were losing workers. But what they could do is fund having caseworkers available to their employees who knew what the state programs were, the city programs were, the local charities were, that focused in solving those tough life issues. And that led to a big improvement in retention, driving those favorable economics again.
That is really wonderful. And there's so much here that's resonating. You can see it in our active chat. Believe it or not, we are out of time for this portion. So thank you so much, Dr. Fuller, Madeline, and Brian for being here. And no doubt this is a conversation that keeps going.